Kwaba, welcome to this week's edition of Ghana in Focus with myself, Kwame, Ghanaian broadcaster, writer, journalist, podcaster, and entrepreneur. And in this week's edition of Ghana in Focus, we've got two we've got two features for you. The first one of which is Mahama's speech at the recent United Nations General Assembly, talking about how the economy is skewed against Africa, and also how the United Nations needs to form and that Africa can have a permanent seat at the council. So I want to explain why that speech was useless for Mahama, with all due respect. And we'll also have another one coming up for you later on. So before we get into the podcast, just to make your way, if you like what you hear, please subscribe to Ghana Africa in Focus on YouTube. So look out for Ghana Africa in Focus on YouTube. Hit the notification bell, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast, YouTube will notify you of that. Also, Spotify, we're on Spotify as well. Look out for Ghana Africa in Focus on Spotify. Click the follow button, meaning that every time we upload a new podcast, Spotify will notify you. All right, so tell your friends, family, social media networks of this great podcast called Ghana in Focus. And also, we've got some great news for you. Ghana Africa in Focus is one of the biggest podcasts in Ghana. And so you can find this on the platform called Feed Podcast. So we're on Speed Podcast. So you can just look for top 80 podcasts in Ghana, and you'll find us there. And that's on the feedspot.com podcast platform. So if you want to look out for that as well, you can get other podcasts about Ghana. So just Google top 80 Ghana podcasts, and we're there. We're also, we're in the top 20. So thank you to all those listeners in Ghana who are making Ghana Africa in Focus one of the most popular podcasts in Ghana. All right, so again, if you want to do business in Ghana, I do offer a consultancy session, particularly if you're listening in the West. You want to do business in Ghana, you want to know about getting land, how to get land legitimately, what steps to follow, etc., etc. We do offer a consulting period session with myself. I've got more than 10 years experience of working in Ghana. I own real estate, I own land, I've got businesses in Ghana. So I have business experience as well, and we know the terrain as well. And also, like I said, you definitely need the Ghana card if you want to do any type of business in Ghana, even to get a phone contract. So if you want to know a lot about that and other bits and pieces, you can just look out for my email address, which is on the footnotes to the show, and we can book you in for a consultation. We charge $30 an hour for a 4-hour consultation, or we charge $20 for a half-hour briefing session. All right, so let's get into the podcast. Mahama's speech at the United Nations General Assembly, why, in my opinion, it was futile. All right, so President Dramani Mahama of Ghana was one of a handful of African presidents who spoke at the recent United Nations General Assembly every September, running about this time of the year. World leaders gather at the United Nations to talk about issues around the world and how to deal with very specific issues. And so President Dramani Mahama of Ghana, he spoke, I believe, on Wednesday or Thursday of last week. And he, in his speech, for me, two things stand out. One, how the world economy is rigged against Africa. And secondly, how Africa needs to have a bigger say at the United Nations and why it needs to form. So let's deal with the first bit of it. Mahama said that the world economy is skewed or rigged against Africa. Now, this is something I've been saying for years, and if you are a regular listener to Ghana Africa in Focus, just this year, about a couple of months ago, I did a feature as to how the West deliberately stops Africa. And in that, I featured a presentation from Dr. or Professor Howard Nicholas of the University of Rotterdam, in which he said it was basically underdevelopment in Africa, how the whole development agenda is basically a con, and how Africa needs to be put in its place as a producer of raw materials by the Western powers. And so what Mahama said, aligned my point that I've been talking about for, since this podcast evolved 4 years ago, about how, the world economy, institutions like the IMF and World Bank are not necessarily for African development, but is, wanting to keep Africa down using, very, very devious and circumspect means. And like I said, Dr. Howard Nicholas' presentation about development in Africa basically proved that point. And so, Mahama should not cry foul of a system that was never designed for African emancipation. Yeah, this is why Kwame Nkrumah set about to industrialize Ghana, because he knew that really Ghana could not rely on outside agencies, and for that matter, Africa could not allow or rely rather on outside agencies to foster in its development agenda itself, and also, emancipate itself from imperialism. Yeah, so this is why Nkrumah's whole agenda was to A, industrialize Ghana, and also B, use as a model for other African countries to follow, and also for Africa to unite as one single body. Yeah, so, rather, I understand why Mahama said that, but in truth, nothing's going to change. So what Ghana and what African countries need to do is to come together economically, right? Which they are trying to do in terms of the Africa Free Trade Area, which is now the world's biggest economic partnership. Is bigger than the EU and is bigger than NAFTA, which is the North America Free Trade Area. What Ghana and Africa got to do is trade with one another. Because if Africa is just 2% of global trade, right, that is obvious telling you something not right there in terms of if Africa is home to between 60 to 70%, 60 to 70% of the world's mineral resources, but yet has got only 2% of world trade, shouldn't that raise a red flag? Shouldn't that be cause for concern? Shouldn't we be asking questions in Ghana and Africa? And so for me, rather than complain about a system that's not going to change, because that system been in place, essentially since slavery, or enslavement rather, that system is not going to change overnight. What Ghana can do is do what Nkrumah was trying to industrialize itself. Industrialize yourself first. So what? And the ironic thing is, Ghana does more business with the EU, America, China, India than does with other African countries. So for me, if you are serious about wanting to balance the imbalance of trade between against Africa, what you got to do is foster more intra-Africa trade. Yeah, the more trade we do with one another, the benefit that will have on our individual countries, A, and B, it will benefit the entire continent. Yeah, because rather than goods and services moving outside of Africa, goods and services and the methods of production stay in Africa, moves on the continent, thus creating opportunity, thus creating wealth, and thus creating jobs for our teeming youth. And so, Mahama should not complain of the system, but him being president of Ghana can use his position as president to internal, i.e., develop policies that will allow Ghana to be self-sufficient in every strata of human endeavor, be education, health, employment, agriculture, food security, energy security, etc., etc. And B, by having more close links with African countries, with fellow African countries, as opposed to North America, EU, India, China, Japan, what have you. Yeah, by fostering coincidence with Africa, yeah, we can begin to, balance the scale, so to speak, so that rather than have it against us, the system against us, we can work, uh, outside of the system, i.e., inter-African trade, trading amongst ourselves, yeah, and that can create opportunities for African development, African growth. So that's that bit I want to say about, Mahama complaining about the world economy being skewed against Africa. Because like I said, it was never designed, how the world economy is structured today based on enslavement, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, as Nkrumah warned us about, yeah, it was never designed to emancipate Africa. And so as long as, our political elite are aware, I'm not sure if they are aware, because a lot of them are respectfully puppets and stooges. If they're not aware, yeah, then this is what they've got to do to make Africa, have more of a say on global economic affairs by, having more trade amongst itself. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about in terms of Mahama's speech is that he said that the United Nations needs reform and that Africa deserves, to have a seat at the table of the United Nations. Because obviously, you've got the 5 permanent members of the United Nations who are US, UK, France, China, and Russia. Yeah. So even India, with all its economy and, big population, India does not have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. But in terms of Africa now, again, like I mentioned, the United Nations was never designed for African emancipation. It was never designed to essentially talk about African problems. Do you see, unless it's in their favor, do you see them talk about Sudan? The war in Sudan, the same way they talk about Gaza, yeah, or Ukraine? They don't, because Africa is of no one's concern. The war in Congo. Do we talk about that in United Nations? Has anyone passed a resolution in the United Nations, condemning the war in Congo and the suffering and the pain that's given in the Congo? No, because it's not on the agenda. Yeah, and despite Africa having 54 different countries, yeah, even though we deserve to have a seat on the permanent council, truth of the matter is we're never going to get a seat on the permanent council. And if we did have a seat on the permanent council, right, that seat would be manipulated by the other powers that be, who essentially fund our development. Yeah. So for me, again, rather than complain about United Nations, I mean, the best thing for African countries to do is to get out of the United Nations. Because like I said, the United Nations serves no purpose as far as Africa is concerned. Yeah. And this is why it's important that we have to make the African Union a proper African continental body, because right now, African Union has got nothing to do with African unity or African emancipation. Yeah. The days of Nkrumah and even later in Gaddafi, where the African Union was funded by African people, those days, and when it looked at African unity specifically, right, about how to get the continent thinking on with one voice on global affairs, those days are gone. Because after Gaddafi's death in 2011, and Gaddafi he bankrolled using the oil wealth, African Union. But since his murder in 2011, right, and I may want to talk about that soon, right? Since his death in 2011, the African Union now is now funded by the very same imperialist powers that has got its knee on Africa's head. So we need a reset in terms of the whole idea of the African Union, and we need a whole new paradigm in the way African Union is governed, African Union is managed, and the African Union deals with situations internally and externally. Because like I said, the war in Sudan, that's a classic case of the African Union do nothing. They're doing nothing about the war in Sudan or the war in Congo. Yeah. But the EU and NATO are doing something about Ukraine because it's on their doorstep. And they've got to do something about that because they're threatening the security, not just of Ukraine, but the entire European Union. So Congo and Sudan, it must be on our radar as Africans, yeah? Because those two wars threaten the security, not just of those two countries, but of the continent generally. And so this is why we need a strong African Union to speak on behalf of the global African community. And so rather than, you know, try to engage or assimilate into United Nations that does not have interest at heart, the best thing to do is leave the United Nations, as far as I'm concerned, and the body that is there, the African Union, have a reset, make it more robust, make it more accountable, and make it more African-centered to deal specifically with African problems and African solutions. So that's my take on the key aspects of Mahama's speech at the just ended United Nations General Assembly. If you like what you hear, please share it to your friends, family, social media networks. Subscribe to Ghana African Fix on YouTube. Subscribe to Ghana African Fix on Spotify. And we'll see you in the next edition of Ghana in Focus.